I think you could easily make the case that Shadowlands was by far the best expansion. I mean, just look at everything we got with it. There's the whole new area with all the new Shadowlands creatures and everything going on in it. That's very different from everything that we'd seen before. There were two new professions added that just fit in very well with all of the other professions that were available, had their own things going on, but were also still different from everything else. There was the new luxury apartments added. Those were great. Always happy for more expansion on the player housing feature. Honestly, I really think it would be difficult to frame any other expansion as doing quite so much for Anarchy Online as the Shadowlands expansion did. What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Sounds Good Makes Sense, a discussion show for the World of Warcraft player. My name is Devilor, and today, with the War Within expansion releasing this week, I thought it'd be fun to look back over all of the previous expansions and sort of compare and contrast them and put together some semblance of a list of what I consider to be my favorite expansions that have released, as well as some of my sort of lesser favorites. And I want to be clear, I'm going to be talking a lot about just my own personal experiences with each expansion here. I'm not trying to make like a super scientific, like dedicated list of like, this was objectively the worst expansion, this was objectively the best expansion. That's not really what I'm trying to do here, because video games are subjective. We've been talking about that a lot recently. This is more about my experiences with the different expansions, which ones I enjoyed the most, which ones I enjoyed the least, and why I feel that way about each individual expansion. I'm also, for obvious reasons, going to do my best to remove from consideration anything that's directly related to my time at Blizzard. I'm going to be looking through this from the lens of myself as a player as much as possible, and removing things like that time that Warlords of Draenor released and it was absolutely miserable for me for like 2 weeks because I was a community manager and everyone was really angry because nothing worked. We're going to remove that from the equation for Warlords of Draenor and just look at like, how did I enjoy the experience of it instead? So very subjective, very much just a list of my own personal experiences. Let's go. We're starting off with number 10 on the list, at the bottom of the list, with Dragonflight. Just getting right out there in terms of like why this is such a subjective list, because from everything that I've been told about people who've been actively playing Dragonflight through the entire expansion, it's been very good. The opinion of Dragonflight is much higher than some of the more recent expansions like Shadowlands and BFA. But for me, Dragonflight didn't really land. A lot of it was due to the fact that, like, honestly, in fairness, there's probably part of it that's due to the fact that I just needed to step away from WoW for a little while. And then my experience with Dragonflight would have been mostly as a returning player. And I feel like Dragonflight as a returning player has been really tough. There's just so many different systems to catch back up on. There's so many things going on. There's a lot in Dragonflight, and that's probably great if you've been an active player throughout the entirety of Dragonflight. But for me, having stepped away from the game for a little bit, then trying to come back to it, which, by the way, is not the first time that I have done that. There are other times where I stepped away for a little bit and came back and was able to get right back into things and keep going. For Dragonflight, coming back into the game was very, very difficult for me because I just felt like I had no idea what was going on. I felt like there were way too many systems. And ultimately, it was a situation. I've done a video about this as well. Episode 9 of Sounds Good Makes Sense. If you want to go back and check it out, I talked at length about why I was not playing Dragonflight. It's just an expansion that was difficult for me to get back into. And as a result, this is really the first expansion. Dragonflight is really the first expansion that I have had difficulty finding something I wanted to focus on when I got back into the game, or just throughout my entire experience in the game. It's been the first expansion where I kind of launched it up, went to look around at everything was available, and just kind of went, nothing here really interests me, and stopped playing. Now, I suppose another important thing to tack onto this is that my WoW itch has been getting scratched pretty heavily by a season of Discovery. So there is probably some sort of element in there where if SOD didn't exist, I would have gotten back into Dragonflight much more readily. Dragonflight it had this like, there's too much going on and I could just go play SOD instead, so I'm just going to do that sort of situation to it. There's lots of reasons for why that could be the case. Again, very subjective list, very much just focused on my own experiences, which ultimately means that for me, Dragonflight comes in at the bottom of the list because it's really the only expansion I've ever like just kind of went, I'll wait for the next one on. Moving on to number 9, Shadowlands. No, not the Anarchy Online. The Anarchy Online Shadowlands expansion was actually very good. I have super fond memories of Shadowlands from Anarchy Online. And I actually didn't hate WoW's Shadowlands nearly as much as a lot of people seem to. Like there was a lot that I still really enjoyed about Shadowlands. So spoilers, the rest of this list, these are all parts of the game that I enjoy. There hasn't been an expansion other than Dragonflight where I was ever like, yeah, I don't really want to play anymore. Shadowlands was one that got pretty close though at a few points in time. For me, a lot of the reason for that was just it was just kind of dark and dreary the whole time. And I've talked before on the show about how environment design and the situation that your character is immersed in constantly can sort of end up feeling draining if it's just too dark and dreary all of the time, too depressing of an environment all of the time. And that was really ended up being the case, or that really ended up being the case for me for Shadowlands, where it's like, okay, I'm going to log in, I'm going to go to the Maw, I'm going to go to Torghast, I'm going to go hang out in Maldraxxus or Revendreth or whatever. And I do really enjoy it. Like the environments were very good. They just kind of all ended up being this really like depressing environment aside from the Druid Zone that I always forget the name of. Aside from that one, they all ended up feeling, and I guess Bastion to some extent, they all end up feeling really like dark and depressing and oppressive all the time. And that to me eventually just made me go, I could log in, but I'm going to log in and then be surrounded by the Maw, and I don't really want to do that. And there's a few other reasons that put Shadowlands kind of low on the list for me. Covenants, I just didn't really like Covenants. I didn't, even internally at Blizzard, I'll say this. I was saying this is a bad idea from basically the beginning on that whole thing, just to make sure my stance on Covenants is clear. I didn't like the way that they were put together. I felt like their inclusion into the story felt like an excuse for the gameplay of it, as opposed to feeling like this is a story, like an important story thing. These covenants are here, and it's important for the story that you tie yourself to one of them. Like it ended up feeling the other way around to me, where the story hook felt like an excuse for why you had to pick one. Things like Torghast, I really loved Torghast in Alpha. And I've used it as an example a few times on the show to describe how sometimes adding rewards to things can ultimately ruin the content that you're adding rewards to. In Alpha, it was really, really fun. It was this roguelike, essentially, version of the game where you just, the point was to see how far you could get. It was to see how crazy you could make your build be, how ridiculous all of these powers you could put together would be, to where you could just keep climbing and climbing and climbing and go further and further and further inside Torghast and just do some absolutely nutty stuff. And it was super fun. Then they felt the need to add the legendary acquisition method into Torghast, which turned it into mandatory content, which meant that they had to make it something everybody could do, but also meant they had to make it something that you couldn't do on repeat infinitely. And all of that changed the way that the gameplay worked in it so much that it turned into this like watered down mini dungeon thing that felt more like a chore to go do instead of something fun to try and push yourself and try to keep going and going and going, hoping for that ridiculous, crazy build that gave you that roguelike feeling of this run, I'm really going to go far. And there was the whole Sylvanas storyline thing with Shadowlands that really just, I just didn't like the way the story went in Shadowlands. I do want to mention, just to make sure it's absolutely clear, that very few people who were involved with the writing team at the time that Shadowlands was releasing and afterwards are actually directly at fault for a lot of how they got to that point in the first place. It's almost like maybe there was some guy who was just really adamant that a very stupid thing should occur, and then was no longer with the company by the time Shadowlands actually came out, so that then the people who were then on the writing team at the time had to try to salvage this very stupid thing that happened that should never have been written in the first place, but was now canon. So they had to deal with it the best way that they possibly could. And were really just stuck in a horrible situation of dealing with this awful, awful, stupid story they were set up with and trying to turn it into something useful. It really just really awful situation. But really the writers of the Shadowlands team were actually fine. It was that other guy. He was the problem. All that said about Shadowlands, there was still plenty that I liked. I had a lot of fun with Mythic Plus during Shadowlands. I did stick to mostly lower keys because I was just personally having more fun with the like 4s through 8s in Shadowlands than I was really trying to push much higher than that. The legendaries, while very annoying to get, and the method of actually earning them was obnoxious, once you did get the couple of legendaries that were deemed to be the best for your class, there were some really fun effects. I remember there was a lot. I was playing Shaman a lot in Shadowlands, and I really enjoyed the like extra chaining legendary and stuff like that. And some of the smaller storylines, especially in zones like Revendreth and Maldraxxus, were really fun. I really enjoyed things like going around and bumping into Lady Vosh on a character that I had previously been farming in Serpentine Caverns all the way back in the day, and having her be like, "Oh, of course you're here now," sort of thing. Like that was fun to me. I enjoyed a lot of the flavor of the smaller stories inside Shadowlands. It's just the overarching story I felt was a little meh. But let's move on. Number 8. Hello, it's me in the middle of editing much later at night, realizing that I said number 8 and then actually talked about number 7, and just forgot to talk about number 8 at all when I was doing the initial recording to this. So I'm just going to do that now. Number 8 is Battle for Azeroth. And this one gets a little bit more of an extra boost over the previous couple that I was talking about, Shadowlands and Dragonflight, just because I feel like it ended up in a really great place. I feel like the last couple of months of Battle for Azeroth were actually really fun. We had horrific visions that were in a state where they were just really fun to go through. We had like all the different systems and stuff were in place, like the Heart of Azeroth, the corruptions, and so on. But they had reached a point where Blizzard had put all of the like catch-up mechanics and stuff in that I felt like those systems really needed from the get-go, from the beginning, to actually be enjoyable. Like having the rotating vendor in place for the corruption stuff, it would have been much better if that was in from the beginning. Having the essences be a bit more easy to acquire than they were when they first came out would have made the essence system much better. So I feel like Battle for Azeroth ended up in a pretty good spot. It just kind of took the whole expansion to get there, which is why it ultimately ends up at number 8 on the list for me. And obviously there were some early missteps as well, like Azerite armor. That was a system that Blizzard was pretty open about the fact that they just didn't spend the amount of time that was needed and didn't give it the amount of time that it was needed to iterate on that system and make sure that it was in a good state before pushing it out. They just kind of went, well, this is the system that it is. Let's get it out there. And that's something that Blizzard was pretty open about at the time. I remember that very clearly. Still means that ultimately it was something that needed more work, needed more time in the oven before it came out. Also, weirdly, I ended up playing Alliance a lot more than Horde during the Battle for Azeroth, and that was almost entirely because Borealis was just a much nicer capital than Dazar'alor was. Like the Horde capital sucked. It was all spread around all over the place. You literally had to take a flight path to get from one part of it to another. That was a bad capital city. Borealis, on the other hand, was beautiful. It was great. Everything was in, not like all clumped up together or anything, but it was still in reasonable spots. You could get around it relatively easily, and it was a nice capital city to spend some time in. Other things that I loved about Battle for Azeroth, I thought the war mode change was very good. I really appreciated that ability to be like, I like to go out and participate in world PvP, but sometimes I just want to bust out a couple of world quests and be done. Sometimes I'm logging on for 20 minutes and I don't want my interaction and what it is that I'm trying to do to turn into, okay, well, I'm now getting involved in a world PvP battle. I don't have time for this right now, so I guess I'll just log off. Having the ability to say, I don't have time for PvP right now, so I'm going to turn war mode off, go out and do my couple things. Then when I come back later, I can turn it back on. That felt really good to me. I also felt like Mythic Plus, they kind of cleaned it up a little bit. There were still issues with Mythic Plus in Battle for Azeroth, specifically a couple of the dungeons I recall being kind of obnoxious. But Mythic Plus as a whole, as a system, I feel like really sort of hit its stride in BFA and really cleaned up a lot of the little bits and pieces of stuff, the rough edges essentially from its first incarnation in Legion really came together in Battle for Azeroth. So ultimately, I don't think Battle for Azeroth was a terrible expansion, but if I'm listing off all of the expansions, I think it ended up in a good place. If I'm listing everything off, it still ends up pretty low on the list overall, just because lists are lists and that something's got to be down towards the bottom. In this case, Battle for Azeroth comes in at number 8 for me. Let's move on and talk about the actual number 7, which is Warlords of Draenor. Now, I know there's a lot of negatives to be said about Warlords of Draenor, and those are all very valid, I think. But there are a handful of positives for Warlords of Draenor that bump it up the list a little bit for me. The negatives, like I said, a lot of those are pretty obvious. Things like the garrison. I just didn't really like the garrison and how so much ended up being tied to the garrison, to the point where when I was logging in to do my like daily wizard chores or whatever in Warlords of Draenor, most of the time it was essentially in a single instance where no one else was around. I know a lot of people loved that. For me, it was kind of annoying. I want to be out in the world and interacting with other players and just at least seeing other players around. And I want a reason to go somewhere else to do something, so that I'm not just logging in on 4 different characters, essentially sitting in the same zone the entire time and going around and picking plants and so on. The garrison for me was kind of a miss. The story was definitely weird and hard to follow in Warlords of Draenor. Like the whole time travel but alternate universe at the same time thing felt really gimmicky, and honestly ended up making the expansion feel like, oh, we're out of ideas of different ways to go back to Warcraft 2 and 3. So we'll just do Warcraft 2 and 3 again. I guess mostly Warcraft 2 again. We'll just do that again. That whole, I guess Warcraft 1 even, like the story, this is what I mean. This is how difficult the story was to follow in Warlords of Draenor, because it was just all over the place, and the whole alternate history paths, it's time travel, but it's also dimensional travel, but also it's now its own pocket dimension, but now it's not, and there's things carrying through it. There's things that don't carry through it, and it's really arbitrary what actually comes back through and what doesn't. Like the story was a mess. And obviously, one of the big things in Warlords of Draenor was the ability pruning. There were definitely some classes at the time, by the end of Mists of Pandaria, that did need a little bit of pruning. I don't inherently believe the idea of this class has too many buttons, let's take away some of those buttons so that it's a more manageable class to play. I don't disagree with that notion, but the game definitely did not need a carte blanche all the way across every single class. Let's cut them all down to like 7 or 8 rotational buttons max. That was unnecessary. That was not needed, and it put a lot of classes in a really, really rough situation. It is like silver lining to this, somewhat nice that it then resulted in the class changes in Legion. We're going to talk about Legion a little bit later. The fact that Warlords of Draenor happened to the classes did then mean that Legion could happen to the classes. So there are some like silver linings to it, but it's still a major net negative. And it would have been nice to have skipped the whole, let's make all the classes so easy that, you know, you could play it on a Xbox controller with half the buttons disabled. We didn't need to experience that directly as players ourselves to be able to get to where things were later. So the ability pruning, and there's still to this day some abilities that were pruned in Warlords of Draenor that I really do think need to come back to the game. Things like Eyes of the Beast. Like, why is that? Maybe it's around nowadays. I don't actually know. I didn't really play Dragonflight that much. I haven't been playing Hunter since Legion, I think, at this point. So anyway, long story short, ability pruning in Warlords of Draenor would not rate very high on Yelp. That said, like I was saying earlier, there are some big positives for Warlords of Draenor that pull it up a little bit. One of those is that the raids, while there weren't very many of them in Warlords of Draenor, the ones that did exist were great. Like Highmaul was really super fun. The Blackrock Foundry is among the best raids of all time, in my opinion. And then Hellfire Citadel as well. That one was super, super fun. I really, really enjoyed all of those raids. Didn't make it quite all the way through Hellfire Citadel. We got to Manaroth, and then no, I'm lying. We did actually get Archimonde down while we were progressing in Hellfire Citadel. We did it like once, and then we never went back again because we were all super casual at the time. But the raids and the raid encounters were all really fun, and they all felt like they had something interesting to them, and they were very well put together. So there's a major positive there. Another positive is that I really felt like in Warlords of Draenor, despite everything else was going on, arena and PvP balance was pretty good. Arenas in particular were really fun for me during the Warlords of Draenor timeframe. This was when I got super into arenas for quite a while. I was even commentating tournaments and stuff during the Warlords of Draenor life cycle. So there were some positives for Warlords of Draenor in direct gameplay that, even despite everything else that was going on with it, still bumped it up a couple notches on the list for me. Moving on, number 6 on the list, coming in right around the middle, is the original release of World of Warcraft. Now, I know I'm probably going to get a bunch of flack for not saying that original WoW was the best version of WoW that ever existed and should never have been changed beyond that whatsoever, but that's just not how I feel. I feel like original WoW was very good. Like, I have a ton of nostalgia and happy memories for the original release of World of Warcraft, and the original game has a lot of things that it did right that no expansion has really gotten as good ever since. Like, for example, the sense of exploration and world building in the original release of World of Warcraft, no expansion has ever been able to match that. See, even Nikki agrees that no expansion has ever been able to match how much you could just really get immersed into the world in the original release of the game and just go out and explore and like that, just do the whole the core MMO feeling of World of Warcraft was never quite the same as it was during that original release. And it should be noted that for its time as well, like the when it came out in 2004, this was groundbreaking. This was an incredible new type of MMORPG or new take on the MMORPG genre when it came out in 2004. It was absolutely insane how good World of Warcraft was when it came out. And for a lot of people, especially like myself included, it was life-changing for me, right? Like I would not be even remotely where I am today if it wasn't for World of Warcraft and if it wasn't for the original release of WoW. And while I personally am someone who believes that, yes, some of the expansions improved on the game in ways that made it better than what it was when it originally released, there's so many people who still want to play an unchanged version of the 2004 release of World of Warcraft, or at the very least, like patch 111, essentially the end of where WoW in its original release, the end of where it ended up towards the end of the classic life cycle, the original release life cycle. There's still so many people who want to be playing that game that it's very hard to say anything super negative about where it was. Again, this list is purely objective based or purely subjective based on my own opinions and based on my own experiences in the different expansions and different releases for World of Warcraft. So that's why I am putting the original release at number 6 on the list. But it's hard for me to really make a case that it couldn't be number 1 on someone else's list. The things about the original release that I look at and I say, okay, I'm glad that WoW has moved on from those and gone into different directions. The things that to me are what puts it down at number 6 and not much higher on the list are things like 40-player raids. I still believe, and I'm going to continue to believe, despite what the classic Andes constantly tell me that I'm a terrible person for saying this. I think 40 people is too many for a raid. I think that the amount of organization necessary to get 40 players together precludes a lot of what makes raid encounters fun for me. So like, there's just things that you cannot do with 40 players in your raid that you can do with 20 or 25 or even 10. And you can have more individual responsibility for specific characters in those smaller raid sizes that make those encounters more fun for me. The rotations for a lot of classes in the original, like the classic era style, a lot of the rotations end up being very empty and open. And again, a lot of players like that. For me, I prefer having something to do, and I like having an involved rotation where I'm actually choosing between multiple different buttons that I could press at any moment in time, and I'm deciding what the best one is based on that moment in time when I'm going through my rotations. The way that hybrid classes were treated in Classic, I don't like very much. There was kind of this sense of like, well, you could heal, so instead you're going to be bad at these other two options. We're going to present you with the option to DPS or to tank, but you're going to be bad at those because you could be healing. I just don't think that was very sensible as class design goes. But that's honestly, all of this stuff is part of why I've been enjoying SOD so much, is because to me, SOD is WoW Classic, but with those few changes in that make it into the game that I think, like, they make it a better version of itself to me. So again, WoW Classic or original release of World of Warcraft still ranks pretty high on this list for me. Just again, speaking about my own experiences, my own opinions, I think there are a few expansions that improved on it and made it be better than it was. And the most direct example of that is number 5 on my list, which is the Burning Crusade. This is definitely the, like, quote unquote lightest expansion. This is the one where it was the original game and then they added some stuff, and that was really it. They didn't do as much in the way of like huge reworks or anything. There wasn't any big, we're going to shake everything up thing that came out with the Burning Crusade. It was basically, here's a new continent, here's some class changes, but nothing too dramatic, because they were still in the whole hybrids shouldn't be as good as pure classes sort of thing. But this all makes sense because it was like the first expansion, right? This is the first time that Blizzard had put out an expansion pack for WoW. So it makes sense that they were going to keep things relatively close to the chest during that. And I genuinely considered rolling TBC and the original release together for purposes of this list, but I do think it's worth discussing them separately because of some of the more important changes that were made in TBC. Things like dropping to 25 player raids, things like the few class changes that did occur, things like introducing daily quests and so on. These were all things that improved on the original release enough to rank it as, yes, it's still very similar. It's still very much the same game and it's very much the same vibe. But there were these big enough changes that I felt were worth discussing separately. And to that end, it made TBC really feel like just an evolution of original WoW. It felt like they were just dialing in on what was really special about the original release and trying to improve on that as much as possible and make things more more approachable and more accessible. Isn't really the word I'm looking for, because thinking about TBC and calling it accessible is a little bit crazy. It was not very accessible at all, especially when you started getting into the deeper raids and it's like, okay, would you like to come do Black Temple? Here's this list of 12 other things that you have to do first. And 12 is probably understating it. But it still really felt like an evolution of original WoW. And it was also, for me, an expansion where raiding really started to come into its own. Like, despite all the attunements and everything that you had to do, it really felt like you could make the argument that maybe towards the AQ40 or Nax period of original WoW was when raiding started to really become like a thing in a sense. But prior to that, raiding was, I think a lot of people don't remember this about the original release, but raiding was very commonly considered to be like, ew, you raid? What a nerd. All the rest of us just do dungeons and like Ubers at the most, but you're going and raiding? Wow, you must be a real nerd. And it was like actually kind of looked down on by the general populace of the game at the time. But once we got into the Burning Crusade, that was the point where it really started to become like, oh, wow, you're raiding? That's so cool. Like, you're actually putting the effort in. You're actually very good at this game and so on. That perception kind of shifted, which is a very funny thing about how player bases can shift in such ways. But yeah, TBC was really when raiding to me became something that people aspired to do and they really wanted to get into those raids. But let's move on. Number 4 on the list for me is Cataclysm. Now, Cataclysm had its issues for sure. I know that Cataclysm, like when Cataclysm Classic was announced, there were so many people who were like, ew, who wants that? And I didn't end up playing Cataclysm Classic, but I really wanted to. The whole reason I didn't play it was because there was just too much World of Warcraft at the time. But Cataclysm for me is one of the higher expansions on the list because, yes, while it had its issues, things like the content pacing, especially around Dragon Soul, where we were just in Dragon Soul forever, things like the over reliance on reputations and daily quests, things like the difficulty curve in Firelands. I'm not going to talk about Cataclysm and not talk about how Heroic Ragnaros was just stupid step up in difficulty from literally the previous boss in the dungeon, like just difficulty spike up the wazoo, which I guess is a phrase that people say. I don't know. But overall, it was still a really solid expansion. The raids were still really fun, even with the Heroic Ragnaros issues. The raids were really fun and really good. The class balance was very good. Class balance in Cataclysm was among the best, in my opinion. Not perfect, obviously. There were still issues, but it was still very good overall. And I felt like every class and spec was playable in some sense or another. And I did like the talent and glyph system in Cataclysm a lot. I felt like where they ended up with, yeah, we don't want to go down to 61 point talents. We don't want to keep going down this same talent tree forever, which I understand and I agree with that. I felt like okay, we're gonna have 31 talent points and then this glyph system, and then there's a few things that are interchangeable in those, and the where they went with it. I would have actually really liked to have seen them stick with that talent system for another expansion or two to really give it a chance and see what they could do with it. They kind of dropped it off immediately in Mists of Pandaria, but in Cataclysm, I felt like it worked really well. And the PvP in Cataclysm was pretty good as well. Battlegrounds especially. I had a ton of fun with Battlegrounds during Cataclysm. And that might be a bit of part of why Cataclysm ranks so high for me, is because this is like, I have a ton of nostalgia for Cataclysm because this was when I really started to come into my own as a content creator. Back in the day when I did a lot of Battleground streams with my rogue. during Cataclysm, back when it was just in TV still. Which, by the way, this week is actually my 13-year partner anniversary on Twitch. So that's insane. But anyway, we're going to be doing a stream for that on Thursday, or excuse me, on Friday, actually, the day after the War Within release. We're going to be doing a 13-year partner anniversary stream. It's going to be a lot of fun. Anyway, yeah, Cataclysm was the expansion where I first really started to be like, yeah, no, I can do this streaming thing. I can really lean into this, and we can have a lot of fun with it. And I did. And so as a result, I've just got a lot of nostalgia for Cataclysm. Reminder, this is a list about which expansions did I personally have the best experience with, not necessarily which were the best expansions. So that's why Cataclysm comes in at number 4. Coming in at number 3, immediately following Cataclysm, we had Mists of Pandaria. Now, say what you will about a lot of other things in Mists. There were definitely some missteps made. Things like the over-reliance of daily quests and so on, again, continuing into Mists of Pandaria. But the raids were top tier. Like, the raids in Mists of Pandaria might still be the best raids ever released, at least in my opinion. They were very fun. The encounters were tuned tightly. The mechanics were fun to interact with. The fights felt different and interesting in different ways. The way that you would play with either 10 or 25 players and how each player had something to do in all of these raids, they were just really good. Raids in like Throne of Thunder in particular is one of the best raid instances to ever exist. And Siege of Orgrimmar was really good too. We got stuck in there for like 16 months or something crazy like that. It was a long time that we were stuck in Siege of Orgrimmar. That sucked, but the raid itself was still very good, and I had a lot of fun with it. The classes I was playing at the time, which were Prot Paladin and Affliction Warlock, both Prot Paladin and Affliction Warlock. Affliction Warlock and Mists of Pandaria, to me, is what Affliction Warlock should aspire to be. The way that the Affliction played in Mists of Pandaria was so fun and so like descriptive of itself and so like quintessential to itself, I suppose is the word I'm looking for here. Like, Affliction Warlock was correct, I guess, is what I'm trying to say in Mists of Pandaria. That's what Afflock should be. It's gotten close in a few different cases since then, but the Mists of Pandaria Affliction Warlock was just so fun and so good and worked well. And yes, it was very strong too. Don't get me wrong. Like, part of what was making it fun was that it was also a little bit OP, but the way that it played, just the mechanics to it, was really, really good. I ended up maining Affliction Warlock for a while in Mist just because I was having so much fun with it. And Prot Paladin as well was really fun. And those were kind of the two classes that I was really maining at the time. And it added the Monk class, which for me has been Monk has been one of my favorite classes to play ever since it came out. I keep ending up maining a Windwalker, even when I start off an expansion playing something else. Like in War Within, I'm probably going to start with my Shaman, and then maybe level a Warlock or something. But I just know at some point later in the expansion, I'm going to be back to playing Windwalker. That's just where I end up because Windwalker is so much fun to me and always has been. I still think a lot about the old version of Storm, Earth, and Fire, where you had like specific copies that you could put on a specific target, and your copy would just go sit on that target. And I much preferred that environment. But I still have a lot of fun with the modern Monk as well. I don't know, just adding Monk was such a good thing in Mists of Pandaria's favor, that bumped it up the list quite a bit. I will say that the overall vibe in Mists of Pandaria didn't land as well for me as it did other expansions. It just felt a little bit cheesy overall for me in Mists of Pandaria. And another point against it is that arenas were an absolute mess. Like the 45 to an hour long to sometimes even longer, like Lock Shaman mirror matches in arenas in Mists of Pandaria, that I don't miss that in the slightest. So there were definitely some things that count against Mists of Pandaria for me, but it still ranks really high on the list just because of how much fun the actual gameplay was. Coming in at number 2, perhaps controversially, Wrath of the Lich King. Wrath was just a really good expansion, and there's just so much, like, it hit so many vibes correctly. Where to, like, as a Warcraft 3 fan, especially playing through and getting to see like, oh, this is the cave where Arthas first found Frostmourne, and having the Lich King be kind of present throughout the questing experience and around and doing his weird Batman voice. That was always weird to me, but like having the story that was going on there while still being interspersed with probably the best exploration that an expansion had since the original WoW release, and still probably the best exploration of any expansion. Like the the environments being different enough and all having their own thing going on. And sometimes, like, you go over to Sholazar Basin and people are like, Lich King, who's that? We've got frogs and Wolvar over here, like, and they're warring against each other. That's all that really matters over here. That's just our thing. That's what we're doing over here. What's a Lich King? We don't even care. We're having our fun little tropical ice getaway over here. Like, I loved things like that in Wrath of the Lich King, and the way that it felt like another continent, not another like grouping of a couple of places that were all interconnected in some way. It felt like a continent in the sense that like a real world continent is, where, yeah, you go over to Europe, sure, there's like, it's all technically the same general area, but things are very different in like Italy than they are in France and so on. And those are countries that are very close together. Let's not even talk about the ones on the opposite sides of Europe, but still, it felt very explorative. It felt like the sort of thing where I could actually get immersed in the story a lot more. And honestly, just the story of Wrath of the Lich King was super good. I really enjoyed it. The raids, especially Ulduar and Icecrown Citadel, were very good. In fact, those two raids I would consider among the best raids of all time. Ulduar probably ranks a little bit higher than Icecrown Citadel for me, but they were still very, very good raids. Both of them were, that are listed up there amongst the best raids. Hybrid specs finally got the ability to play the game properly. Things like Retribution and Protection Paladin were actually just as good as their other counterparts, and in fact, even were able to excel in certain ways on certain fights, which was where I think they really started to settle into how they wanted to approach the idea of multiple specs and how to make them each feel like they had a moment to actually do something cool and actually have something that was their thing. Where we started running into cases where, yeah, it's nice that you have the Retribution Paladin on this fight because you have an extra blessing of protection for a Nubarak and stuff like that. So there's definitely a lot to be said for Wrath of the Lich King in terms of class design and class balance as well. I do think that the talent system did start to show its age. And I was definitely very much in favor of, let's not go to a 61 point talent tree in Cataclysm, which was why I was excited to see the talent point changes in Cataclysm. But for what they had with the 51 points, the 51 point trees, it still worked very well, and the classes all felt very very cohesive, and there was just a lot to like about Wrath of the Lich King. I will also mention the whole the rating situation of having both 10 and 25 player on normal and heroic, and especially when you needed the badges of justice or valor or whatever they were called at the time, when you needed all of those things, you felt like you needed to do like essentially 8 to 12 raids in a given week because you were trying to collect all of this different stuff and you were trying to do all these different things, which meant that there was just a lot of raiding on your plate in a given week as a more hardcore player during Wrath of the Lich King. That's a relatively minor negative in the grand scheme of things, though. I ultimately overall have very little to complain about with Wrath of the Lich King. But we still have number 1 on the list to get to, and that for me is Legion. Really, Legion for me was almost the perfect expansion for World of Warcraft. Yes, it had some flaws. It had some issues, especially at first with things like artifact, the way the artifact leveling worked, as well as the legendary acquisition. Those were issues that it had, but they ultimately got cleaned up pretty early on in the expansion's life cycle. Unlike BFA, where you had like Azerite armor, and that was just a problem, and then later on the Heart of Azeroth, and then the corruption thing, and those weren't really like, they didn't feel cohesive until the expansion was basically over, and they put in like catch-up mechanics that ultimately the game kind of should have had in the first place. For Legion, at the very least, those issues did get cleaned up relatively quickly and relatively early on in the expansion's life cycle, which was good to see. It introduced Mythic Plus, which M Plus has become one of my favorite ways to play the game ever since it's released. I still like raiding. It's just a huge time commitment. Whereas Mythic Plus, I can still get that sense of playing my role and playing my character to its fullest extent, just in a smaller, more drop-in, drop-out sort of environment. So I do really love Mythic Plus. Legion was the expansion where that was added to the game. The raids were still very good in Legion. There were still some very, very good and very enjoyable and very memorable raid encounters during Legion. Arenas weren't perfect, but they were still pretty decent in Legion. But one of the big things about Legion for me that very stands out is that spec identity became much more of a thing. And with the whole like class hall thing, and all the different storylines that you could go on, one per spec, all these different storylines that you can go on and explore and understand what's going on, and how your class fits and how your spec fits into the overall storyline. That was amazing. That was really, really enjoyable to me. And it sort of took the ashes of Warlords of Draenor's ability pruning and said, okay, hold on. We've accidentally made all of these classes feel super dull. Let's really hone in on what makes each spec interesting. Let's really dial down and make sure that each spec has its own identity, has its own place, and has its own like purpose in the grand scheme of class design and combat design inside of World of Warcraft. And I think it ended up in a pretty good place. Yes, there's still some classes that are still sort of around and weird, and I still don't think that hunters should have ever gotten a melee spec. The game didn't need more melee classes. I would have preferred to see hunters get anything else to make survival more interesting. Make it a healing spec out of, I don't, with homeopathy as some sort. I don't know, just anything other than more melee class. We didn't need another melee class. That's no shade against the people who do enjoy modern survival hunter. I just don't think the game needed it at the time. But aside from that, the class design in Legion, I think, was a very good and important step forward for the game. Things like world quests being added, which gave me a lot more to do. Just as like, I'm just going to hop on for a few minutes and, oh, look, there's something interesting over here. I'm going to go do that to get this reward. And that's been very, very good for the game, I think, overall. The Mage Tower is something that needs to be mentioned for Legion, because it was one of the first times that there was really a big, strong solo gameplay. Like, if you accomplish this, you have done something super cool that everyone had a version of. It wasn't just like an individual class at a time. So that was super cool as well. The story was great. Again, as a Warcraft fanboy, going to the Broken Isles and going through all of the stuff that was around there and interacting with demon hunters, bringing out demon hunters. I did feel a little bit bad for warlocks at first, because they kind of took what demonology was and turned it into its own class. But I feel like demonology has ended up in a state where it's much better off, at least nowadays. It probably took a little bit of time to get there, and I didn't play demonology too much during Legion to be able to speak very cohesively on how it was at the time. But I do think that's something that Legion changed that has ultimately become for the better, because demonology really feels like its own thing now, instead of, okay, well, you're a warlock, but you're also kind of a demon hunter, where it was before. And again, I know a lot of people preferred when warlocks were essentially demon hunters, but I think having a demon hunter class, if you want to play a demon hunter, and allowing warlocks to do more warlocky stuff, I think that's ultimately, for me at least, I prefer that outcome. Now, I will put kind of an asterisk on Legion a little bit, because there is probably something to be said for the fact that Legion being so good may have been, and almost certainly was, in a big part, the result of Blizzard just kind of saying, yeah, Warlords of Draenor isn't really hitting right. So they ended up just being like, okay, we're going to leave y'all in Hellfire Citadel with Tanan Jungle as kind of the only real new anything added for Warlords of Draenor throughout its life cycle. We're going to leave y'all in there for a while and just kind of walk away from Warlords of Draenor so we can focus more on Legion. I think a lot of the stuff that happened with Legion would not have been possible if they hadn't kind of left the previous expansion to sort of rot on its own. And that's not something that's sustainable for the game going forward. If you have an expansion that people are enjoying and are engaged with and are having fun with, you really can't afford to say, okay, everyone, it's going to be a year and a half before you get anything new, because we're going to work on something good again in the future. That doesn't really work out. People get bored and stop playing, and then that's a problem. So I do think there is something to be said for Legion having such a high, being a part of Warlords of Draenor having such a low to it, and Blizzard being able to step away from that and say, and honestly, kudos to the development team at the time for taking the risk of saying, all right, this isn't working, so let's just drop it and all hands on deck for Legion production, so that we can make sure Legion is an absolute banger, because it turned out Legion was an absolute banger. But that is a situation that most expansions will not have the ability to replicate. It's you would assume at the very least that it's going to be much more. The goal at the very least is never to be like, this expansion is terrible, so let's just not work on it anymore so we can work on a good one next time. That is not the goal. It does kind of work out that way sometimes, but that's not what you want. at the end of the day. So I think there is a bit of an asterisk there for Legion in terms of the fact that it literally just got more development time put into it than most expansions, but doesn't change the end result that it's still easily my favorite expansion. And that wraps up my very unscientific, very much my own personal opinions, and that's about it. And honestly, these are things that change all the time for me as well. Like what I consider to be my favorite and least favorite and so on changes all the time. So that's where I stand as of today in terms of my overall opinions. That'll wrap up that list. I hope you enjoyed the general rambling about that particular topic. I do have a couple of questions that I want to get to. Thank you for everyone who sent in questions. If you have anything that you would like to ask, you can just leave a comment on the video, or if you're a patron, you can head over to Patreon. There will be a link to a form inside the posting for this episode that you can fill out that form and you can submit your question there, because patrons do get first crack at having their questions answered here on the show. But let's get into some answers. I do want to, before I actually go into directly answering questions, I do want to give a general response to a theme that was posted in comments on my last video. Wasn't really like a direct question, just a lot of people seem to have misconstrued when I said that I don't mind Blizzard trying to make money. They seem to think that that meant that I just gave Blizzard a blank check to do whatever was possible to make money. The point I was trying to make, and I thought I made pretty clear, but I don't know, maybe they didn't watch the video or whatever. Maybe they won't even see this part of this video. So whatever, maybe I'm just talking to myself right now. But the point was, the desire to make a profit is not inherently bad for a company. What you do to make that profit is where the problem comes in. So when people are saying, oh, this is just Blizzard trying to make money, like, okay, I don't care. Blizzard's trying to make money. Yes, obviously Blizzard is trying to make money. But what about it is bad? Focus on what the actual thing that's bad about it is, which isn't that they're trying to make money. It's they're doing this in this way, and that's why it's bad for them to try and make money. Ultimately, in last video, anyone who watched all the way through it will remember that I did say that I actually think the early access period is a bad way for them to try to make extra money. I do not like that there's an early access period for the War Within. It has, to me, more negatives than positives. A lot of people have given the standard response of, oh, it's not that big of a deal. It really doesn't mean anything after a couple of weeks. And that's correct. Obviously, that yes, after a couple of weeks, it doesn't mean anything. But I don't think it does. I don't think it has no real effect means it's good. The question is this good for the game or is this bad for the game? And I think it ultimately has more negative effects than positive effects. And I don't like that it's I don't like that vector for Blizzard to try to make money. I don't care that Blizzard is trying to make money. Obviously, Blizzard is trying to make money. That's their company. They sell things. That's what they do. Anyway, just wanted to give a little bit of clarity on that. It's not about just the fact that it's making money doesn't mean that I'm giving them like a blank check approval to do whatever they can to make money. That's not what I was trying to say. Some people seem to take it that way. Anyway, let's move on to the actual questions that were sent in. This one comes from Sakurai on YouTube, who said, do you think we'll see any of the experimentation done in SOD cross over to retail and or other versions of WoW? Would we ever see Warlock tanks in retail, for example, or do you think that's too funky for retail design? So I think there is some potential to see elements of what is done in Season of Discovery inspire things in the future for retail. So it's possible that we'll see some elements of the way that like Warlock tanks, for example, were implemented, make their way over to class design in retail. But I think an important thing to remember is that SOD doesn't have demon hunters, retail does. So Warlock tanks, the concept of a Warlock tank going into metamorphosis and doing that whole thing inside SOD is just a vengeance demon hunter in retail. That is the equivalent concept there. So what I mean when I say we might see elements of that is we might look at some of the things that it's possible that something that the SOD team does that then the retail team looks and says, oh, hey, that was kind of a cool idea. Let's add that to demon hunters, right? I think that is how we would see that crossover exist. I don't think we would see a metamorphosis Warlock tank in retail under any circumstances. Metamorphosis is a demon hunter ability. I do still think it's possible that at some point they decided to give Warlocks a tanking tree, but it would have to be something different than just straight up metamorphosis itself. It could be, I don't know, maybe they would have a big tank pet or something that they then control directly. or they like the warlock becomes the pet and you're the, I don't know. There's ways that this sort of thing could be implemented. There's some crazy ideas that could be come up with to make warlock tanking exist. But I think anything that would take directly from the metamorphosis style of tanking for warlock in SOD would almost certainly, if they decided, yeah, that's a cool idea, we're going to implement it in retail, it would go towards demon hunters. Similarly for like mage healers, a lot of the mage healing kit in SOD is essentially an evoker concept for a bronze dragonflight and very tiny wimey sort of stuff. That it would make more sense for them to take things like that and apply it to the evoker than it would necessarily for them to just make a time mage be a thing. They could still make a time mage be a thing. I'm less confident in this one than I am in the warlock thing, but I would expect that sort of transition to work that way. Now it is very super possible that in any way they might reshape things and change things around in the future. There's a lot that could be done along those lines, and I am confident that there's going to be people who are on the retail team who are going to look at what the classic team is doing and take ideas and inspiration from it regardless. Like there's always going to be some sort of element of like, ooh, that's super cool, I would like to do that. Like one thing that I would like to see, for example, I'm really enjoying in SOD the resto druid method of like wrath spam to get clear casting procs to then be able to spend no mana on your big heals and sort of utilizing that as a way to do sustain healing in situations where you don't need to be pumping out healing nonstop. I'm enjoying that quite a bit, and I would love to see something like that. Maybe there already is that I'm just not aware of it, but I would love to see something like that make its way over to retail, where there's kind of that you DPS in your downtime just to do something that will help you sustain some amount of healing going forward. I enjoy that sort of loop in SOD, and I think that would be something cool to try to apply similarly in the future for retail. But whether that's an exact carbon copy of it or just an inspiration sort of thing where it's like, oh yeah, let's make it so that druids in retail, you just spam wrath to get a free heal sometimes and skip some of the other steps in there. Like that sort of stuff could be interesting to see. Anyway, that is how I see that sort of transformation and transition of ideas working. Less about like, ooh, this spec was cool in Season of Discovery, so let's just copy it over. More along the lines of, these are interesting things that we saw SOD doing. How can we implement that in a way that makes sense for retail? And one more question for today comes from Masood Voon on YouTube, who said, is any of the old content from 10 plus years ago still on YouTube, such as the dungeon strat guides? Just curious. So there's some of the really old stuff still available because that was on Ciderhelb's YouTube channel. But unfortunately, what happened was, as a lot of you may know, there was a point where TankSpot, the website that we were making all this content for, and the sort of banner that all this content was made under, that was sold to a company called Zam around 2010. That time frame, if I'm remembering correctly. At which point all of that content was no longer being made for the Ciderhelm YouTube channel. It was being made for the Zam official YouTube channel. And that's where all of that content lived for quite a long time. That includes most of the weekly Marmot. That includes all of the encounter guides past like Wrath of the Lich King, as I remember. Maybe even past like, in fact, the older War guides might have ended up. I don't remember exactly where we stopped with the raid guides, but a lot of that content made, especially in like Cataclysm and onward from there, that was all made for the Zam official YouTube channel. Now, when I left TankSpot to go work at Blizzard, that all just sort of got folded underneath just Zam will take care of it. And I had made for some arrangements for that to be dealt with in some way before I left that never really got followed up on by Zam. Unfortunately, I'm still a little bit annoyed by that because I talked to people about like, here's what should happen with TankSpot after I'm gone. Here's how this should be taken care of. And they had agreed with it and then never did it. So that's annoying. Ultimately, TankSpot, the website, ended up getting like, it wasn't getting updated anymore. And it was built on a software called vBulletin, which had security holes that needed to get patched constantly. And because it was no longer getting patched constantly, eventually some hackers got into it and just kind of destroyed the thing. And Zam, rather than fixing it, just decided to shut the website down. Later on, they eventually sold to a company called Fanbyte, which for some reason that fully escapes me, decided that they were going to rename the Zam official YouTube channel to, I think it's just called Fanbite on YouTube, take down every single old video that was on there and start uploading their own new videos, which meant that they had like this channel with like 100,000 subscribers and videos with like 2 viewers. Like it's actually it's actually kind of crazy to me that they did. Like, why not continue to collect all of that residual revenue from those videos still being around? Like, why did they take all that down? I don't know. I don't understand. But that means that a majority of the weekly marmots, all of PST, all of rapid fire, all of that stuff is no longer accessible anywhere. I don't have copies of all of it because I uploaded it to YouTube. So why would I keep I didn't keep a lot of the original files around archived anywhere, which is a mistake that I'm not repeating with Sounds Good Makes Sense. I am going to be keeping all of these archived somewhere just for my own personal use in case YouTube blows up someday or something. So I still have them to go back and reference. But unfortunately, yeah, that means that a lot of that old stuff is gone. And that makes me very sad because it's like a huge significant portion of my life been erased from the internet that I can say, like, I go to people like, yeah, I used to do all this. You can't see any of it because some company decided to delete it all, but that's what I did for a long time. That really bothers me. A lot of the old like Game Breaker stuff, like old Legendary episodes and so on, that's all like gone now today as well. So that sucks. That I don't like at all, and I'm very sad about all of that. But unfortunately, that's the state that we're in. So yeah, sorry for the bad news and the answer to that question. Once again, everybody, if you would like to ask your own question, please feel free to leave a comment below, or like I said, go on over to Patreon. That's patreon.com/Devilore. You can check that out, and there's a bunch of nice little perks that patrons can get as well. You can also check out the Sounds Good Makes Sense merch store, and I'd be curious to hear your ideas if you've got anything that you just don't see on there, but you're like, oh, this would be cool in this sort of way, or this would be cool as one of these things instead, or what about this sort of design? So just any ideas for the sort of merch that you might like to see, please do let me know, because the site that I'm working with is actually pretty easy to work with, and I might be able to just whip it up. So let me know. Anyway, I am going to wrap it up there. Thanks again, everybody. I'll see you later.